Russian assaults in many parts of the front line have essentially stopped. The Ukrainians have been able to make several tactical breakthroughs that have, taken a couple hundred square kilometres. So it will have meaning for some time. The Russians will eventually adapt. They'll come up with a response, but they're not quite there yet.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we're joined by Major General Mick Ryan. Mick served with the Australian Army for more than 30 years. He's a senior fellow for military studies at the Lowy Institute and adjunct fellow at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And his latest book is called The War for Ukraine. Mick, great to see you again. Welcome back to Frontline.
Okay, it's great to talk to you again.
So Mick, another week, another round of talks between Ukraine, Russia and the US. And it seems yet again, they have stalled. What struck you about this round?
Well, I guess what struck me the most is people think that this round would have been any different to the previous ones. At the end of the day, the Ukrainians, I think, have been very accommodating so far with these talks. They've really accommodated the American administration. I think they've demonstrated a willingness to talk and negotiate. But the Russians all the way through have not changed their position even in the slightest amount. This isn't a negotiation for them. They have objectives, they want them, and anything short of that is not worth their time, apparently.
And of course, Zelensky says, in terms of that major sticking point, which is territory, that they won't lose dignity, and he's sticking with that. Before these talks had begun, President Zelensky had reiterated this goal to destroy 50,000 Russian occupiers a month, his words, and bringing about, do you think that is going to be more effective as a policy or as a strategy and bring about more effective negotiations going forward?
Well, it was announced by Zelensky at Munich. It had previously been announced by the Defense Minister Fedorov about a month previous. I mean, it's not a strategy in and of itself, but it contributes to Ukraine's strategy of increasing the pressure on the Russians by having them come to the realization that this war isn't worth the expense in people or money. They're not there yet. And Ukraine, by increasing the number of Russian soldiers that they kill or wound to 50,000 a month should be beyond what they can mobilize, and therefore bring the Russian leader, I wouldn't say to his senses, but to a realization that the Ukrainians are just not going to give up here.
I'm going to ask you a bit more about the effect of Russia losing Starlink and the Russian military using access to that. But before we do that, Ukraine is using it as well, and they've been able to take advantage of this blackout. But how did Starlink actually become so important to each side in this war? And can you just tell us a bit more about how it's used?
Well, the Ukrainians using Starlink was a response to Russia's advantages in the conduct of electronic warfare. The Russians went into this war with the ability to find, to locate normal military radio communications, VHF, HF, these kind of things. So the Ukrainians needed something that was more secure, couldn't get them detected as easy. Starlink was the answer. But as the war went on, they found that Starlink, which was pretty secure and hard to intercept, had uses beyond command and control on the battlefield. It had use in the control of drones and uncrewed systems in the Black Sea. So it really had become central to their use of many of their digital command and control systems. The Russians, who, if nothing, are fast followers when it comes to innovation, saw this, knew they didn't have anything that could compete with it, and started using pirated versions of Starlink.
And Ukraine came to a point just recently, they recognised that denying Russia access to Starlink was absolutely crucial and critical. Why now?
Well, I think the real straw that broke the camel's back was when they picked up Starlink terminals in Russian Shahed drones late last year. They knew for some time, probably for 2 years, the Russians were using this on the front line. But when they started using Starlink deep inside Ukraine on these Shahed drones, that was when they thought they had a pretty rock-solid case to take to SpaceX and Elon Musk to have them shut down Starlink for the Russians. Clearly, SpaceX and the Pentagon agreed with them, and they went through this process of what they call whitelisting Ukrainian Starlink. So everything that wasn't Ukrainian couldn't be used in Ukraine itself.
And this came as a huge surprise, didn't it, to the Russians? It happened, overnight, presumably. How were they taken by surprise, and how important is this element in modern warfare?
Well, it took them by surprise, certainly tactically, because pretty much overnight, many of their command and control systems stopped working. Many of the systems that they use to control the drones that strike deep behind Ukrainian lines and target logistics and reserve locations weren't working. So it really caused a breakdown in the cohesion of many units, meant they couldn't coordinate either attacks against the Ukrainians or defense against Ukrainian attacks. And as we've seen, Russian assaults in many parts of the front line have essentially stopped. The Ukrainians have been able to make several tactical breakthroughs that have, taken a couple hundred square kilometres. So it will have meaning for some time. The Russians will eventually adapt. They'll come up with a response, but they're not quite there yet.
And you write about this in one of your recent Substacks, and you write about the element of surprise in war and how even when the battlefield is, quote, transparent, as we all talk about these days, it's still very relevant and very powerful.
Yeah, it's incidents like this that show the battlefield's just not transparent. I mean, you can't see into the hearts and souls of humans with a satellite system. It's certainly highly visible, but high visibility isn't the same as great wisdom about what you're seeing. So it's still possible to trick your adversary. It's still possible to be clever with tactics, and it's still possible to generate surprise against an adversary like the Ukrainians have done here.
And it is testing the Russian military's ability to adapt. How has it tried to replace the communications and its battlefield capabilities that have been dependent on Starlink?
Well, there are a few different things it'll do. It'll be kind of like Moneyball. You can't replace Starlink with one system. It'll need a bunch of different systems to replace it. It's using line of sight, wireless communications. It'll use some other satellite communications. It's got its own indigenous program. That's not really going anywhere quick. And as I speculated in my article, maybe this might have them turn to the Chinese and use their Starlink variants. Not as capable, certainly not as resilient, but they're out there. So they'll have a few different things that they'll return to cope with the lack of a Starlink kind of communication system.
And when you consider the element of surprise throughout this war, which side, is it the Ukrainians or the Russians, who've been proven most effective, do you think? And what examples do you think are the most startling?
I think both sides have achieved surprise at times, but certainly the Ukrainians appear to be better at this. I mean, person for person, Ukrainian soldiers are much better than their Russian counterparts. And we should also remember that, this is existential for the Ukrainians. If they lose, they don't have a country. If Russia lose, they just go home. So the Ukrainians throughout the war have surprised Russia, and they've pleasantly surprised the rest of us with things like the defeat of the Russians in northern Ukraine in 2022, the first attacks on the Kerch Bridge, the attacks on Kharkiv in 2022. So there have been areas where the Ukrainians have surprised the Russians, and they'll continue to want to do that. These spiderweb attacks last year, deep inside Russia and against airfields, was a wonderful example of the Ukrainians achieving surprise.
We're fast approaching the 4th anniversary of the war, and adaptation is a key characteristic right now, as it's moved from maneuver to positional and attritional. To how would you describe it exactly today?
Well, I think the war certainly has a degree of dynamism. It's not static, because every day there are operations going on, not just along the front line, but attacks deep behind the front line within 100 kilometres. Also, the long-range strike campaigns both sides are undertaking. You're seeing a fair amount of dynamism in the strategic influence campaigns that both countries are running, their efforts to influence their allies and fence sitters to either support them or not support their enemies. So it's still very dynamic. There's just not a huge degree of movement and change in control of territory. You're looking at between 100 and 200 square kilometres a month changing hands. Historically speaking, that is a very small amount.
And when you mentioned the strategic influence campaigns, how would you describe Ukraine's?
Well, I think Ukraine has shown that democracies can also engage in strategic influence and disinformation campaigns in a way that I think many Western countries forgot after the Cold War. We forgot the strategic information agencies that many of our countries had to put our stories, to put our narratives out there, to show why democracy was better than authoritarianism. So I think Ukraine has shown the way for many other democracies in how we might approach the really profound cognitive warfare campaigns that China and Russia are waging against the West. The problem that Ukraine has is the attention spans of most people in the West are very short. We have a lack of strategic patience. And if we were to track how many times Ukraine appeared in the news over 4 years, I think we'd see quite a precipitous drop over the last couple of years, unfortunately. So that kind of works against them, but they're still doing very well, I think.
So, what do you think the West can actually learn about strategic influence from Ukraine?
Well, firstly, learn that it matters. I think that, in the very early days of this war, the strategic influence through social media and just normal Ukrainians getting out their stories played a really important part of showing the West that the Ukrainians and Ukraine was a country worth defending. The impact that just small things like Zelensky's video when he came out of his shelter saying, "We are all here," I think can't be underestimated. That was inspiring not just to his own people, but to people overseas who, quite frankly, don't always get a lot of heroes in their own political systems. And Zelensky provided that for a long time. So I think there are many things that we'll be able to learn about the conduct of influence and information operations by democracies from Ukraine.
And that challenge must be particularly difficult right now when, if you look at the rounds of negotiations we've seen, if you take into account that what Russia's objective might be just to simply exhaust people into not caring anymore. How does he go forward with that? How do you plan for that?
Well, it's pretty tough because there's the old story, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth pulls on its pants. I think I might be paraphrasing Winston Churchill there, but it's very true in the modern world. I'd say the lie gets all the way around the world before the truth gets on their pants these days. It's that quick. I think with generative AI and these kind of things, it's very quick to be able to get misinformation out there. With big data, it's easier to target different groups in populations with different forms of messaging. We need to be able to firstly kind of educate our citizens to have the right hygiene against misinformation from authoritarians. And then we need to be able to do our own information operations. For example, show in Russia what life in a democracy where people speak Russian really looks like. Because at the end of the day, this is one of Putin's core problems. He can't afford to have people who also speak Russian on his border who live in a prosperous democracy. That is death for his regime. And it's exactly the same problem Xi Jinping has in China. So us projecting that kind of information into their country, really gets back at what they're trying to do to us and break down the cohesion of our societies.
And as we take stock, approaching the fourth anniversary of the war, you point in your writings to three strategic realities that have been underscored by recent events. Can you talk us through those?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're seeing that, that firstly, the negotiations that have been going on, not since the beginning of the Trump regime, but for some time, really aren't going to go anywhere in the short term because Ukraine and Russia are just too far apart in their positions. Russia has not moved an inch since the beginning of the war in its position. It wants the end of Ukraine and it wants the end of NATO as well. I don't see that either of those happening anytime soon. I think another strategic reality is that Europe has learned that Russia truly is a threat, not just to Ukraine, but to itself. And whilst it may not have moved as fast as we would have liked, it is moving to build more indigenous defence capacity and build its defence forces and munition stocks up in a way that we couldn't have imagined even 4 years ago. And I think the third reality is that this war is just going to continue for some time to come. It's hard to see any kind of resolution that is going to be enduring or just coming out of the current round of negotiations. Something significant is going to have to change either on the battlefield or in the politics in Kiev or Moscow for there to be a change in the perspective of the negotiating parties.
Do you have any idea of where that change might be the most likely place in the politics or on the battlefield?
Well, the real place it has to occur is in the Kremlin. They started this war. They've continued this war. And is they that they can pull out tomorrow and the war would be over. So I think the Kremlin is where everyone is looking to for some kind of change in calculus, change in desired outcomes from this war. But the situation with Putin is he's got himself to the point that he's spent so much lives and treasure that he has to bring his people some kind of victory, and he's nowhere near being able to do that at this point in time.
And while he seems willing to accept catastrophic losses for the foreseeable future, what do you think the challenges are for Ukraine's allies then? You say the war is not going to end anytime soon. They have announced a raft of military commitments at the recent Ramstein meeting. What are the challenges and what more can the West or should the West be doing?
Well, the first thing is stepping up production of high consumable items, especially air defence systems. I mean, Zelensky's been saying this since I met him in September 2022. You know, he's been saying you need to close the skies. Russia has stepped up the number of drones. That is a very, very high priority. Fortunately, there have been a lot of technological programs to intercept Shaheds and improve the intercept of cruise missiles. And I think we're on a positive trajectory there. I think too that we need to, as much as possible, put robots between humans and the Russians. And that's really what the Ukrainians are doing with their uncrewed ground vehicles at the moment, is trying to put as many of them between Russians and Ukrainian soldiers. But at heart, I think the Ukrainians will need to resolve their problems with the mobilisation of people. They do have a demographic issue. They have an issue with displaced people, you know, millions of Ukrainians having left the country. But the reality of the situation is you don't have a demographic problem if you don't have a country. And Ukraine is going to have to think hard about its mobilisation to prioritise the survival of its nation.
And what do you think about this requirement apparently made by Donald Trump that should there not be some kind of referendum on any elusive peace deal or propositions and no elections by mid-May, that he will withdraw what might have been security guarantees? I mean, this does sound like a lot of talk that actually is going to go nowhere again.
No, it's going to go nowhere. I mean, not for no reason. Donald Trump's called Taco. I mean, he makes these threats all the time, then quietly walks away from them. I will note that he hasn't asked Putin to have a referendum on peace negotiations. He hasn't asked him to have elections. He hasn't forced size restrictions on the Russian armed forces on the Russians. So we should really question Donald Trump's motives here. Why is this focus so harsh on Ukraine whilst not asking for a single thing out of the Russians?
Just interested to get your perspective about how much coverage the current situation in Ukraine is getting in Australia at the moment in terms of the media, and what the perspective is from there.
Well, it's not getting near as much as it should. It gets very little coverage on normal news services these days compared to even a year ago. Yeah, I think people, like in many Western democracies, are focused on cost of living issues, and that's entirely reasonable. But we also need to spare a thought and some resources for the people of Ukraine. I think the Australian government has been pretty lightweight when it comes to providing aid to Ukraine. I think it just provided $10 million, which is its first commitment for some time. We could be better at that. But the polls here, when people are asked the question about Ukraine, are pretty consistent. A very large majority of Australians support Ukraine and think Australia can do a better job of helping the Ukrainians defend their country.
And just to go back to the battlefield, Russia has announced this week the expansion of a research and development organisation for Russian drone capabilities, the Bar-Sarmat Unmanned Systems Purpose Centre, it's called. What is that exactly? Because there is an intention to invest and develop there, isn't there? And advances being the key.
Yeah, this is part of a larger series of announcements they made about the formation of drone units for the Russian military. where there will be a very significant expansion in the number of drone companies, battalions, indeed drone brigades in the Russian military system over the next year or two. Dozens and dozens of new drone units are being established. This is a new R&D system that will work at the strategic level, not dissimilar to Rubicon, but probably at a higher level, that will do things to support the Russian version of the Unmanned Systems Force. As I said before, the Russians are very good at being fast followers. They've copied Ukraine when it comes to drone organisations and drone tactics quite a bit. And I think this replicates many of the existing systems that Ukraine has for drone development and deployment.
What do you expect to see on the battlefield in terms of technology and development in the next 12 months or so?
Well, I think, the drone part of it, there's saturation of aerial drones. I think we'll reach saturation with ground drones over the next couple of years. I think you'll see a greater impact by AI-supported decision-making on the ground and compressing kill chains even further. I think you'll see a greater emphasis on operations at depth, well behind the front line, to have a greater impact on logistics, on transport routes, on casualty evacuation, and those kind of things. And I think you'll see the Russians continue to work on shaping the calculus of Donald Trump and his team, who are clearly oriented towards Russian objectives in this war. I think Putin will continue to do what he can to strengthen Donald Trump's hardline approach to Ukraine.
And when there was an article in the Times this week, or it may have been the Sunday Times, which it describes the rescue of a Ukrainian soldier who'd been abandoned by a robot, basically taken, I don't know how many kilometers to safety, where sadly he then died. It is absolutely unbelievable the kind of conditions that infantry soldiers are experiencing in this particular war. Have you seen anything like this in history?
It was certainly a terrible situation. Indeed, that rescue was done by a combat medic team led by a medic I met on the front line last year in a brigade I had the privilege to visit in eastern Ukraine. Very courageous, very clever people. Whilst the robots are new, and it took 11 attempts to evacuate this young soldier, it's the kind of courage that we actually have seen throughout the history of war, where soldiers will not want to leave their fellow soldiers behind. And whether it's running forward to get them, whether it's sending forward armoured, uncrewed vehicles to retrieve them, this is the kind of behaviour we've seen for thousands of years, where soldiers refuse to abandon their comrades. It's not the kind of behaviour we see much from the Russians, but it's something we've seen consistently from the Ukrainians, who value every single individual.
Yeah, actually, that brings to mind another article I heard, or an anecdote I heard about Russian soldiers surrendering. And one of them was actually picked off by an FPV drone before they managed to be taken into custody by the Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah, there's been quite a few examples of the Russians doing that. I mean, the Russian soldiers know that if they surrender to the Ukrainians, they're going to get 3 square meals. They're going to be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, unlike what the Russians do to the Ukrainians. And they got a pretty fair chance of living to an age that they may not live to if they remain in the service of the Russian military.
2026 is reported to be the year that President Zelensky aims to bring Russian finances to breaking point. Is he getting any closer?
Well, certainly Ukraine has done a laudable job of doing that with its attack on the oil industry, but we shouldn't forget that it's been aided by European nations, by the United States and other countries that have supported and enforced this sanction regime against the Russians. I think the problem is, however, that no matter how dire the situation might be for the Russians, it is not in the interest of countries like China for Russia to fail. So you may see the extension of loans to Russia to get them through this war from countries like China. So we might put a lot of pressure on the Russian economy, but without doing the same with the Chinese. I think the Russians may just skate through.
And while Moscow has been consistent with its objective to decimate Ukraine with its infrastructure and erode Western political will, it hasn't reached those objectives yet, has it? What do you expect from Putin Is it going to be a doubling down, or is it new tactics?
Well, I think he'll continue with much of what he's been doing. I think he will look at the aerial campaign against Ukraine's power industry over this winter, which really brought Ukraine almost to its knees. It was the culmination of 4 years worth of strikes. It wasn't just this year, it was the cumulative impact. And he may be thinking, oh, well, another year or two like that, we could do even worse to the Ukrainians and really force them to their knees. He didn't succeed this time. He hasn't succeeded for 4 years, but that hasn't stopped him trying before. I think he'll believe that another year or two of this, he may well force a political accommodation from the Ukrainians. I don't think that's the case, but I think that's what Putin believes.
So doubling down then?
I think so, unfortunately, for the Ukrainian people.
And finally, if we can turn our attention to the Pacific region, what lessons or inspiration do you think can be drawn from the recent electoral victory of the incumbent prime minister in Japan? And does it serve as any kind of counterbalance, do you think, to the worldview that was expressed by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference?
Well, I think it was a pretty emphatic victory last Sunday by the incumbent Japanese prime minister. She really delivered a fairly significant win that has given her a mandate for many of the domestic policies that she wants to introduce around taxes, domestic consumption, these kind of things. But it's also given her a mandate for further transformation of the Japanese self-defense force, of the constitutional arrangements that govern its use, Japan's alliances and strategic partnerships with countries in the region, including Australia's, which is a very important one to us. But it's also a mandate for continued engagement with the United States, which is also a very important ally for many of us out here. Japan really is the first line of defence for much of what China does in this region. They're a prosperous democracy. They have been a good global citizen since the end of the Second World War. And I think she has provided a shining example of what a democratic leader might be and how they might talk with their citizens about the nature of the threats they face and the kind of things they need to do to challenge threats by authoritarian regimes.
Something we should all be mindful in these days. Mick Ryan, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Kate. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Kate Gerbeau. For all the latest updates on the war in Ukraine and global security, you can subscribe to this channel and sign up for a membership. You can also listen to Frontline wherever you get your podcasts or on Times Radio at 1:30 a.m. UTC. And for all the latest news and analysis, you can visit thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye for now.